In this video, we're going to be talking about creating a raw transaction with named arguments. So previously, when we were making commands with the Bitcoin CLI, we'd need to know what order the arguments go in. And it can be a little bit daunting sometimes, especially when some of the methods have, 4 or 5 arguments to them. So thankfully there is an alternative to this called named arguments. And with named arguments, when calling any of the commands from the Bitcoin CLI, we can use the named flag as an argument, and then that will allow us to use named arguments. So if this is something you want to do going forward, you can set it as an alias, but essentially what it looks like is calling the Bitcoin CLI and giving it a flag of named, and then that will allow us to start using named arguments. So if we want to test out named arguments quickly, what we can do is use a command that we've used in a previous video to get a new address. So if we go to help and type in get new address to remind ourselves of what arguments it takes. So get new address takes a label and an address type and returns us a new Bitcoin address that we can use to receive money or transactions. So in order to use named arguments for the get new address command, what it would look like is this. So we call the Bitcoin CLI again. We give it the named flag. We call the command we want. In this case, it's get new address. And the first argument is label. So we type label and we set it equal to nothing because we don't want to give it a label, but you could give it anything you want. You could say like, maybe give it a label for a specific wallet that the address is tied to, or something of that nature, or something like, I don't know, holiday money or whatever you want to call it. But in this case, we're going to leave it blank. And then the second argument is the address type. So we can type that in again, address underscore type, and we set that equal to legacy and press enter. And then it does exactly the same thing as what it would if we didn't have the name flagged, but we knew what order to place the arguments in. So this is just a nicer way to get a bit more clarity about what it is you're actually sending in these arguments. So let's try and do a raw transaction using named arguments. So similar to what we did in the last video, we're going to store all of the components that we need to make up a raw transaction into variables. So the first variable we're going to need is the transaction ID of the UTXO we want to use in the transaction. So let's have a look at some of our unspent transactions. So if we do Bitcoin CLI list unspent, we can get a list of all of the UTXOs available for spending. So I'll just scroll up to the top to try and find one with a decent amount of Bitcoin and confirmations. So if I look at this one here, we have 0.01 BTC and 153 confirmations, and it is spendable. So what we want to do is extract this transaction ID as well as the UTXO, the number that gets returned in the list of UTXOs for that transaction, which is the first one, or well, technically the second one because arrays start at 0. So let's command clear this, and I'm going to just copy and paste my command into the terminal just so it's a little bit quicker because we have seen this before anyway. So what I'm doing here is creating a variable called UTXO transaction ID, and I'm setting it to the response or the return value of the list unspent command, and I'm piping it through JQ, which is just a library that makes pulling out values from a JSON array or JSON object a little bit easier. So in this case, we're going to pipe the response through JQ, and we're going to take the first or the second element in the array. Remember, arrays start from 0, and get the transaction ID property. So that's what we do for the UTXO transaction ID. Similarly, we're going to do the same thing for the vout or the UTXO vout that we want to actually use. So we use the first one of that as well. And we need the recipient address, or the address we want to send funds to. So again, we'll find the address of the testnet faucet and send some coins back to that. So if we do recipient and store that in a variable as well, recipient, is that how you spell it? Yeah, that looks right. And give it a string and store that as a variable as well. So now we have our three things that we need to to create a raw transaction. We're gonna store the result of creating our raw transaction in a variable as well. So I had to go over to a text editor to make this a little bit easier to write out. So again, we store the raw transaction in a variable when we call the create raw transaction with the named flag. So the create raw transaction takes as its first argument inputs, and inputs is a JSON array where the first value is a JSON object consisting of the first key, which is the transaction ID, which you set to the variable you've used to store your transaction ID, and the UTXO that you want to use from that set, which is going to be the first one. And the outputs argument is also a JSON array, or a JSON object in this case, where the key for recipient is the address you want to send to, and the value is the amount of Bitcoin you want to send. So in this case, we're going to send 0.0095. So I'll copy that over to my terminal as well. Copy and paste that in, press enter. And that returns us the raw transaction the hex encoded version of the raw transaction. And so we can use the decode raw transaction and pass it the hex string to get a visualization of what that transaction looks like. So again, we pass the named flag, we use the decode raw transaction method, and we use the named hex string argument and set it to our raw transaction here, and press enter again. And so what this does, it returns a decoded version of our transaction. So we can see the ID, we can see what inputs we used for this transaction, and we can see the address we're sending it to, how much, and some information for the Bitcoin script, but we'll talk about that in a later video. So now that we've created our transaction, just like we did in the last video, the last thing we want to do is sign our transaction, or the penultimate thing we want to do is sign our transaction. So I'll clear my terminal again just to make it a bit clearer. So we'll sign our transaction and store that in a variable as well. Again, using the named flag, calling the sign raw transaction method and passing it the hex string from that raw transaction, piping it through JQ, and with the response, we're just going to get the hex value. Okay, so that's not quite right, because sign raw transaction is actually not a method, so the method is not found. So it's actually sign raw transaction with wallet. Cool. And the last thing we want to do now that we've signed our transaction is actually send it so it's on the network. So if we copy this over, the last thing is to do is to call the send raw transaction command again with the named flag, using the hex string argument and setting it equal to our signed transaction, and that should return a transaction ID. Cool, so that's it. So now we've sent another raw transaction, but we've used named arguments, so hopefully it gives a little bit more clarity and reduces some of the errors. So by running the Bitcoin CLI with the named flag, you can use named arguments rather than depending on knowing the order of the arguments. You can always use the Bitcoin CLI help command if you're not sure what arguments go in what order, but just for clarity and ease of reading and ease of understanding, it's more than likely going forward in these videos we're going to use named arguments just to make it a bit more clearer to understand. So I hope that makes sense. If you got any questions or queries, again, feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.